I still remember that morning vividly, the sunlight spilling across my apartment like it was highlighting a stage, the stage on which the biggest betrayal of my life was about to unfold. My name is Emily Harper. I'm 30 years old, and I've spent the last decade building something I thought was secure, a financial safety net, a testament to my hard work, my discipline, and my late nights of sacrifice. $2.5 million. Every single dollar painstakingly saved, invested, and grown over years. I never flaunted it. I never bragged. My parents didn't even know the full extent, or so I thought. My birthday had started like any other, with a quiet celebration of myself and the reflection on reaching 30. I'd never been the kind to demand parties or lavish gifts. In fact, I told my parents weeks ago that I just wanted a quiet dinner with them. Nothing extravagant. The irony now is almost laughable. By the time I sat down at my laptop to check the account, I had no idea that this seemingly ordinary day was about to become a nightmare. I remember the exact second my stomach dropped. The balance stared back at me. Zero. Nothing. Not a cent. My hands shook as I refreshed the page, hoping for some technical error, some banking glitch, anything to explain what I was seeing. But there it was. $2.5 million gone. Vanished. And the transfer history, it was painfully obvious. It had been withdrawn and sent to an account I'd never seen before. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare and find my money safely nestled in my account. But deep down, I knew the truth. My parents, the people who had raised me, the people I trusted implicitly, they had taken my life savings. On my birthday, a detail that burned into me with a cruel precision. My mother's soft voice and my father's hearty laugh now felt like distant echoes mocking me from the past. It's hard to explain the cocktail of emotions that hit me. Betrayal, disbelief, rage, sadness, and an almost dizzying sense of vulnerability. I had always believed in fairness, in love, in family. I had trusted them without question, even when there were little things that hinted at their tendencies, subtle manipulations, casual remarks about how I should spend more wisely, or let them help financially. I had brushed it off, thinking they genuinely cared. But now, I was faced with the stark reality that my trust had been exploited. I couldn't act rashly. That would only play into their hands. The instinct to lash out, to call them and accuse them, not at me, but I knew better. I had built this life on patience, strategy, and calculated decisions. And if there was anything I had learned, it's that revenge is most potent when it's precise, when it lands with undeniable clarity. I didn't want a petty argument. I wanted a reckoning that would leave no doubt about who was in control. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, replaying every interaction I had with them over the last few months. The subtle comments, the curious questions about my financial choices, the veiled hints about helping me manage my assets. At first, they seemed harmless, even affectionate. But looking back, they were breadcrumbs, carefully laid, testing the waters, trying to measure just how much they could manipulate me without overt confrontation. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began drafting a plan. It had to be meticulous. It had to ensure that the tables were turned, that I was no longer the victim in this story. I needed evidence, documentation, and a strategy to make them see the consequences of underestimating me. I wanted them to feel the weight of their betrayal, to experience the realization that I was not someone to be trifled with. While I plotted, my mind wandered to the emotions tangled inside me. Anger was the loudest. Anger at their audacity, anger at the years I had worked to create a secure life, anger at the betrayal of trust. But alongside that anger, there was a simmering satisfaction at knowing that they had underestimated me. They thought my patience and quiet demeanor were weakness. They thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't act. They thought they could take what they wanted, without repercussions. I remembered the countless nights I spent calculating investments, planning budgets, and making smart financial decisions while my peers partied and spent recklessly. I had done this for me, not for them. Yet they had felt entitled to it, as if my hard work was a resource they could dip into at will. The injustice of it fueled my resolve. If they thought they could walk away with my fortune, they were sorely mistaken. By the evening, I had mapped out my first moves. It wasn't about impulsive retaliation, it was about control. The first step was to understand exactly how they had accessed the funds, the account they had funneled it into, and any legal vulnerabilities they had exposed themselves to. I needed precision, not chaos. Precision would ensure that when the reckoning came, it would be undeniable. I took a deep breath and called my financial advisor, keeping my voice steady and neutral, careful not to reveal the storm of emotions inside me. I explained the situation and asked for a complete audit of all recent transactions, tracing the movement of funds. Every detail mattered. Every signature, every transfer, every timestamp could become a piece of leverage if I needed it. As I hung up, a wave of calm began to replace the initial shock. I realized that despite the betrayal, I was not powerless. I had the advantage of clarity, foresight, and strategy. While they had acted impulsively, driven by greed and entitlement, I could act methodically, ensuring the outcome was in my favor. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, at the thought. The game had begun, and I was already several moves ahead. Later that night, I reflected on the duality of my emotions. There was the personal betrayal, yes, but also a professional lesson embedded in the experience. Trust is valuable, but so is vigilance. Love and family are sacred, but boundaries exist for a reason. They had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed, and the consequences of that would be made clear. I went to bed with my mind racing, drafting plans in my head, weighing options, and imagining the moment when I would finally confront them, not with screams or tears, but with calculated revelation. Tomorrow, I thought, everything would start moving, and when it did, I would watch them realize, too late, that they had underestimated me, the one they had raised yet tried to exploit. By the time I finally drifted off to sleep, I had made a silent promise to myself. I would reclaim what was mine, yes, but more importantly, I would teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. Betrayal had lit a fire inside me, one fueled by years of discipline and resilience. And I intended to let that fire guide every move I made in the days to come. The morning after the discovery, I woke with a mix of determination and unease. The betrayal still stung, like a fresh wound, but anger had sharpened into focus. I had spent my 20s building that $2.5 million, every overtime shift, every disciplined investment, every long night of research and planning. And now my parents had waltzed in, claiming it like some entitlement. They didn't see me as their daughter. They saw my wealth as theirs to manipulate. I brewed a strong cup of coffee, the bitter aroma grounding me as I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, sketching out a mental map of everything I needed to do. My financial advisor had promised to provide a complete transaction audit by noon, and I would use every ounce of data to plan my next moves. It wasn't enough to merely know where the money went. I needed to understand the method, the loopholes they exploited, and any vulnerabilities I could leverage. Precision, after all, would be my most potent weapon. But as the hours ticked by, I realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and respect. My parents had believed they could manipulate me because I had always been the obedient child, the quiet one who deferred to their guidance. They underestimated my resilience, my intellect, and my willingness to act decisively when wronged. That underestimation was a critical mistake. By late morning, the audit arrived. I sat in my apartment, eyes scanning the details, each transaction a reminder of their audacity. Every dollar traced, every account linked, every timestamp documented. It was all there. And with it came the clarity I needed. I could confront them immediately, but that would be reactive. Impulse might satisfy a momentary desire for confrontation, but strategy would secure a permanent victory. I leaned back in my chair and considered my options. First, I would need to regain access to my funds. That meant legal steps, contractual leverage, and perhaps a bit of misdirection. I wanted them to believe they had the upper hand, that they had successfully taken something from me, while in reality, I was orchestrating a net that would ensnare them completely. The thought of their smug faces made a small, cold smile creep across my lips. The day passed in a blur of calls, emails, and document gathering. My apartment became a war room. Legal documents lay scattered across the table, laptop screens glowed with bank account histories, and my phone buzzed intermittently with messages from my advisor. Every detail mattered. The more I studied their moves, the more I realized how naive and overconfident they had been. They were so focused on taking what they believed they were owed that they left themselves exposed in ways that I could exploit. By evening, I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. The trap I had envisioned was taking shape. I wouldn't confront them openly. That would alert them and give them a chance to cover their tracks. Instead, I would use their greed and arrogance against them. I drafted a careful, seemingly innocuous email, inviting them to a family financial meeting to discuss the future of my investments. It sounded ordinary, even conciliatory, but in reality, it was a lure. They would come, and everything I had planned would unfold with precision. As I set my laptop aside, I thought about the psychological toll of betrayal. I had loved these people. I had trusted them. And yet, their actions demonstrated a fundamental disregard for that bond. Betrayal isn't just about theft. It's about the violation of trust, the shattering of assumptions you hold about people you care for. I allowed myself a moment of sadness, a small acknowledgement of the hurt, before letting it go. Sadness had no place in my strategy. Anger, yes. Sadness, no. The night deepened, and I found myself pacing my apartment, rehearsing conversations, imagining their reactions to the evidence I would present. I wanted their realization to hit with clarity. No screaming, no emotional outburst, just undeniable proof that they had crossed a line. And more importantly, that I was no longer a passive player in my own life. Sleep came in short bursts, filled with vivid imaginings of the confrontation. I saw them arriving at my apartment, unsuspecting, confident, and perhaps even smug. I saw myself walking them through the audit, every step highlighting their miscalculation. The thrill of control, of seeing justice unfold on my terms, kept my adrenaline high. The next morning, I woke early, my resolve stronger than ever. I reviewed the plan one final time, evidence gathered, legal counsel briefed, psychological strategy in place. Everything was aligned. I wanted them to believe they were in control, to feel the illusion of power, only to have it systematically dismantled. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was the natural consequence of their betrayal. They had gambled, and I intended to ensure they lost. By mid-morning, I sent the email. Simple, professional, and inviting, a discussion of financial planning and future investments. My parents, predictable as always, responded almost immediately with eagerness and a hint of pride, completely unaware that the trap had already been set. Their underestimation of me was staggering, but also, I realized, the key to the plan's success. As I sat back, coffee in hand, I allowed myself a small moment of reflection. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, autonomy, and self-assertion. I had spent years cultivating discipline, foresight, and intelligence, only to have those qualities ignored by the people I trusted most. Today, I would assert them fully. Today, I would redefine the balance of power in my life. Even as the day progressed, I maintained a composed exterior. I spoke calmly to my financial advisor, drafted additional documentation, and subtly hinted at potential legal action, all without revealing the full scope of my plan. This was a chess game, and I was several moves ahead. The thrill wasn't just in the strategy, it was in the certainty that justice, on my terms, was imminent. By evening, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and calm. The trap was set. My parents were unaware, confident in their perceived victory. And yet, in the shadows of their arrogance, I had built a scenario in which their every move would lead them to the conclusion I wanted them to reach, that they had underestimated me and that betrayal carries consequences. I went to bed that night with a sense of empowerment I had never felt before. Betrayal had ignited a fire in me, and for the first time, I truly recognized the power of patience, strategy, and calculated action. I wasn't seeking revenge in the petty sense. I was reclaiming what was mine, asserting control and ensuring that trust, once broken, would be respected moving forward. Sleep came easier than the night before, not because the betrayal had faded, it hadn't, but because I knew the next day the first moves of the reckoning would unfold. I would see their expressions, feel the tension shift, and watch as the consequences of their audacity became undeniable. For the first time in years, I felt fully in command of my life, my resources, and my destiny. The next morning, I woke with a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. It was as if a weight had been lifted, replaced by a sharp clarity. The trap I had meticulously laid was now ready to spring, and I could feel it pulsing, waiting for the perfect moment. My parents had no idea what was coming. They believed they had won, that they had outsmarted me by taking my life savings on my 30th birthday. But their victory was nothing more than the opening act of a play in which I was the director. I spent the early hours reviewing every piece of evidence, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. Every bank statement, every transfer record, every signature had been cross-checked. I also had legal counsel on standby, ready to step in should my parents attempt to backtrack or cover their tracks. The power of preparation is often underestimated, and I intended to demonstrate that precision and foresight are far stronger than impulsive greed. By mid-morning, I sent a follow-up message to my parents, framing it as a casual reminder about our upcoming financial discussion. I kept the tone neutral, even warm. It was critical that they felt comfortable, even confident, because the element of surprise was essential. Their arrogance was my ally. Their assumption that they controlled the situation made the trap nearly irresistible. I could almost see them, smiling as they read my email, imagining themselves clever and triumphant, completely unaware that they were walking into a net I had carefully designed. When they arrived, my calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the storm that had been brewing within me. I greeted them with a polite smile, offering coffee and water, the aroma filling the room and masking the tension that hung like an invisible thread. They responded with the same casual confidence that had always frustrated me, the belief that familial ties meant entitlement, that love automatically equated to compliance. I started the discussion by framing it as an ordinary financial review. I asked about their thoughts on recent investments and mentioned that I had recently restructured my accounts. They nodded, listening attentively, not noticing the subtle shift in my tone, the slight firmness in my voice that hinted at control, without revealing the depth of the strategy one had in place. As the conversation progressed, I began introducing the audit, casually referencing some transactions, and asking them to clarify details. Their initial reactions were dismissive, but I pressed gently, pointing out inconsistencies that required explanation. I maintained a calm exterior, even as adrenaline coursed through me. Every word, every pause, every glance was calculated to elicit the exact responses I wanted: confusion, defensiveness, and eventually, the dawning realization of their vulnerability. I watched them squirm slightly as I presented more details, their confidence waning with each carefully revealed fact. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she tried to explain the transfers, and my father's jaw tightened, a silent acknowledgement that their overconfidence had led them into a precarious position. I resisted the urge to gloat, knowing that measured control would make the impact far more potent. I reminded them gently, almost conversationally, that financial ethics and legality were not just abstract concepts, they had tangible consequences. My parents, who had assumed familial bonds could override legality, were now confronted with the reality that their actions had exposed them to serious liability. The realization hit them gradually, like a slow-burning fuse igniting a series of emotions I had anticipated: shock, fear, and then a muted anger at being caught. At one point, my mother tried to interject, offering excuses about intentions and the assumption that I would approve. I let her speak, listening attentively, nodding occasionally, before calmly countering with the factual evidence, meticulously documented, showing that no consent had ever been given. The look on her face shifted from defensiveness to disbelief, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from seeing justice unfold. I noticed a subtle change in my father's posture, a slight slump in his shoulders, as if the weight of accountability was physically pressing down on him. They had underestimated me for years, assuming that obedience and trust were weaknesses. They had taken what they believed was mine without permission, and now they faced the consequences. It was a profound lesson in the danger of underestimating someone you claim to love. As the discussion continued, I introduced legal documentation, carefully explaining the rights and obligations that had been violated. My parents' initial confusion gave way to a hesitant acknowledgement of their mistakes. I remained composed, letting the impact sink in without interruption. The silence that followed was almost tangible, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. I also allowed myself a moment of reflection amidst the confrontation. This wasn't merely about reclaiming money. It was about reclaiming agency, asserting boundaries, and demonstrating that betrayal, no matter how close the relationship, carries consequences. I wanted my parents to understand that trust is sacred, and once violated, restitution is not just monetary, but also a lesson in accountability. By the end of the meeting, my parents were subdued, their earlier confidence replaced by cautious acknowledgement. I had achieved exactly what I intended. They realized that their actions had consequences, that their underestimation of me was a critical error, and that their attempts to manipulate me had failed. I did not raise my voice, I did not lash out, I allowed evidence, calm authority, and strategic presentation to speak for me. After they left, I sat alone for a moment, reflecting on the events that had just unfolded. The sense of empowerment was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a deep understanding of the complexity of human relationships. Love and trust are delicate, and once fractured, they require careful navigation to repair. While I had achieved a form of justice, I also recognized that healing would take time, for them and for me. Later that evening, I documented everything, ensuring that there was a complete record of the confrontation, the evidence presented, and their responses. This wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. The careful documentation would protect me from any future claims or disputes, and it reinforced the lesson that strategy and preparation are essential in the face of betrayal. As night fell, I allowed myself a small celebration, a quiet acknowledgement of the power I had reclaimed. I poured a glass of wine, reflecting on the journey from betrayal to empowerment. The lesson was clear: trust must be earned, boundaries must be respected, and when violated, consequences must be met with clarity, precision, and authority. By the time I went to bed, exhaustion mingled with a profound sense of accomplishment. Betrayal had been the catalyst, but it was my strategy, patience, and resolve that had turned the situation around. I slept with the knowledge that I had taken control, not through vengeance, but through careful planning, intelligence, and unwavering self-respect. The trap had worked, the lesson had been delivered, and my life and my finances were secure once again. The morning after I sent the invitation for the family financial discussion, I woke with a strange sense of calm, a quiet anticipation that ran deeper than the anger I had felt the day before. My parents had no idea what awaited them. They thought they had successfully taken control of my life savings, my $2.5 million, but in reality, they were walking straight into the web I had meticulously woven. Every moment of their misplaced confidence was a step closer to their reckoning. I brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open in front of me. I reviewed the financial audit once more, meticulously tracing every transaction, every withdrawal, every subtle misstep they had made. Their audacity in thinking they could act without consequence filled me with a cold, calculated satisfaction. I wasn't just planning to confront them. I was orchestrating a situation where the truth would land on them with undeniable force. By late morning, I confirmed all the legal avenues I could use to protect my funds. I wasn't acting out of petty revenge, though I admit, part of me relished the idea of seeing them squirm, but I was setting boundaries, reclaiming authority, and ensuring that trust, once broken, could not be taken lightly again. I contacted my attorney, carefully framing the situation, and laid out the plan to have them attend a formal review of the accounts. They would believe it was a routine conversation, but in reality, it was a carefully orchestrated trap. When the time came for them to arrive, I felt a surge of confidence. My parents walked in, self-assured, expecting gratitude or perhaps at least compliance, and I welcomed them with a polite smile. My mother clutched her purse a little too tightly, and my father's posture was rigid, yet there was a faint trace of arrogance. They believed they were in control, and that blind confidence was exactly what I needed. I led them to the living room, offering coffee and water as though nothing was amiss. The atmosphere seemed ordinary, casual, and yet beneath it, a taut thread of tension hummed. I began the conversation lightly, discussing recent financial trends and my investment strategy. They nodded and smiled, oblivious to the fact that each word I spoke was measured to lead them deeper into the narrative I had prepared. Gradually, I introduced the topic of recent transactions, carefully highlighting inconsistencies in tone that suggested curiosity rather than accusation. My parents, ever confident, explained each transfer in overly simplistic terms, assuming their justifications would suffice. I listened, nodding slowly, feigning consideration, as I mentally catalogued every misstep they revealed. Their overconfidence was their downfall. They were giving me all I needed without realizing it. As I presented the audit, I carefully guided them through the details, noting every withdrawal and transfer. I asked probing questions, always polite, always measured, allowing them to stumble and fumble through explanations. Their initial dismissiveness gave way to uncertainty, and I could see the first cracks in their facade. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she tried to cover for herself, while my father's eyes darted nervously across the documents, the realization of miscalculation beginning to settle in. I maintained a calm, composed exterior, letting the evidence speak louder than my emotions. This was about control, strategy, and demonstrating that betrayal carries consequences. I explained the legal implications subtly, ensuring that they understood the gravity of their actions without making it overtly confrontational. The silence that followed each revelation was almost tangible, a testament to the power of careful planning and precise execution. My mother attempted to interject, offering excuses about intentions and familial entitlement. I allowed her to speak fully, listening with patience, then countered each claim with documented evidence. Step by step, I dismantled their narrative, letting reality assert itself without a need for raised voices or dramatics. Their faces shifted from confidence to confusion, then to a reluctant acknowledgement of the truth. I watched carefully as my father's posture slackened, the earlier rigidity giving way to tension and discomfort. They had underestimated me for years, assuming that my compliance and obedience equated to weakness. That assumption had led them to overreach, and now they were confronted with the consequences. I allowed myself a quiet sense of satisfaction, recognizing that the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. By the time the conversation concluded, my parents were subdued. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by hesitant acknowledgement and a subtle, almost unspoken understanding that their actions had been wrong. I had achieved exactly what I intended: a reclamation of authority, a demonstration of consequences, and a reaffirmation of self-respect. No shouting, no tears, no emotional outburst, just clarity, calm authority, and undeniable truth. After they left, I sat alone for a moment, reflecting on the events that had just transpired. The mix of emotions was complex: satisfaction, relief, and a subtle lingering sadness over the betrayal itself. Trust, once broken, is never easily restored. But I had acted decisively, reclaiming what was mine and asserting boundaries that could never again be violated without consequence. Later that evening, I documented every detail, from their arrival to the final acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Every document, every screenshot, every note was meticulously filed, ensuring that my position remained unassailable. This wasn't about paranoia. It was about prudence, about ensuring that the lessons learned in that room could not be ignored or undone. As night fell, I poured a glass of wine and reflected on the journey from betrayal to empowerment. The process had been taxing, but the outcome was a profound affirmation of personal strength and foresight. I had learned that strategy, patience, and precise execution are far more powerful than impulsive emotion. I had taken control, not for vengeance, but for justice, autonomy, and the restoration of balance. By the time I went to bed, exhaustion mingled with an undeniable sense of accomplishment. Betrayal had been a catalyst, but it was my intellect, my preparation, and my resolve that had turned the situation around. I slept knowing that I had reclaimed authority over my life and finances, and that the lessons from my parents had been delivered with quiet, undeniable force. The following morning, I awoke with a sense of focus I hadn't felt in years. After the confrontation the day before, my life had shifted in subtle but profound ways. The balance of power had changed. My parents, once so confident in their ability to manipulate and control, were now cautious, tentative, aware that the days of assuming entitlement were over. I, on the other hand, felt a sense of liberation, an invigorating clarity that comes when you've finally reclaimed control over something that was rightfully yours. I spent the early hours reviewing the aftermath of our confrontation, thinking strategically about the next steps. Though I had demonstrated authority and presented irrefutable evidence, I knew the situation required careful maintenance. Relationships are delicate, and while I had won the battle, the war of familial expectations and unresolved emotions was ongoing. I made a mental note to document every future interaction, not as an act of mistrust, but as a safeguard and reminder of boundaries that could no longer be crossed. Later that morning, I received a text from my mother. It was carefully worded, polite, and almost tentative, a sharp contrast to her usual tone. She was seeking guidance on how to rectify the situation and asked if we could discuss options for making amends. I read her words slowly, savoring the subtle shift in tone. For years, she had assumed control over my finances and my life, but now the power dynamics were inverted. I had the upper hand, and for the first time, I could shape the conversation on my own terms. When I responded, I kept my tone measured and controlled. I expressed my willingness to discuss options, but I also made it clear that accountability was non-negotiable. It wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about asserting boundaries and ensuring that trust was rebuilt, if at all, on my terms. I wanted my parents to feel the weight of their actions, to understand that the days of entitlement were over, and that restitution was more than financial, it was moral and emotional. By midday, I scheduled a meeting with my father. He arrived punctually, carrying a briefcase that seemed heavier than usual, though the weight wasn't physical. It was the invisible burden of guilt and recognition of wrongdoing. His expression was guarded, a mixture of apprehension and a faint hope that perhaps the situation could be smoothed over without too much consequence. I welcomed him with the same polite demeanor, concealing the sense of control that had settled into my posture, like a second skin. The conversation began with small talk, as if testing the waters. I responded with calm attentiveness, then gradually steered the discussion toward the topic of restitution. I outlined the legal ramifications of their unauthorized withdrawals, presenting the documentation I had prepared in advance. Every chart, every bank record, every signed agreement was laid out clearly, leaving no room for denial or misinterpretation. My father's initial confidence waned as he realized that this was no ordinary discussion. This was a structured, controlled confrontation, and the evidence was irrefutable. I allowed him to speak, carefully listening as he attempted to rationalize their actions. He mentioned assumptions, familial obligations, and even affection, as though these could excuse the blatant breach of trust. I nodded politely, acknowledging his points without agreeing, and countered each claim with calm reasoning. Step by step, I dismantled their narrative, exposing the reality of their actions in a manner that was firm yet measured. As the conversation progressed, I noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. His hands twitched slightly, his voice occasionally wavered, and a quiet tension settled over the room. The arrogance that had defined their behavior for decades had eroded, replaced by an uneasy recognition that the consequences of their choices were now unavoidable. I kept my tone neutral, almost clinical, allowing the weight of the facts and their own awareness to do the work that anger or recrimination could never achieve. By mid-afternoon, the meeting had taken a decisive turn. My father, realizing that he could no longer argue or deflect, began asking practical questions about rectifying the situation. I provided options, structured repayment plans, legal oversight, and formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Each suggestion was presented clearly and logically, demonstrating not just my control over the finances, but over the narrative itself. This wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching responsibility and enforcing consequences in a way that was just precise and undeniable. After he left, I sat quietly, reflecting on the dynamic that had shifted so profoundly. For years, I had allowed familial obligation to obscure the reality of betrayal. I had trusted, complied, and even sacrificed, believing that love justified tolerance. But trust, once broken, must be managed carefully and boundaries must be enforced. The sense of empowerment I felt wasn't derived from triumph over them, but from the clarity and integrity with which I had reclaimed agency over my life and finances. Later that evening, my mother sent another message, this one more direct and apologetic. She expressed regret for the breach of trust and asked for guidance on how to make amends beyond just financial restitution. I read her words slowly, recognizing the subtle evolution in her understanding. My goal wasn't merely to recover money. It was to ensure that lessons in integrity, accountability, and respect were internalized. For the first time, I could influence that learning process, shaping it on my own terms. I responded with measured advice, outlining steps that were both practical and symbolic, structured restitution, clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and ongoing transparency in future interactions. I wanted my parents to understand that respect and trust must be earned, not assumed, and that their actions had consequences beyond mere finances. The emphasis wasn't on punishment. It was on the restoration of moral equilibrium. By the end of the day, a sense of profound satisfaction settled over me. The trap had worked. The lesson had been delivered. I had demonstrated control, intelligence, and foresight in a situation that had once seemed impossible to navigate without conflict. Betrayal had been the catalyst, but it was my strategic planning and deliberate actions that had turned the tide, restoring balance and ensuring that trust, once broken, could not be violated lightly again. Before going to bed, I documented the day's interactions meticulously. Each text, each conversation, each acknowledgement was logged for reference. This wasn't paranoia. It was prudence, a reminder that when trust has been violated, clarity and documentation are essential tools in maintaining authority and ensuring accountability. The day had reinforced a fundamental lesson. Betrayal can be confronted, trust can be reclaimed, and boundaries can be enforced with intelligence, patience, and unwavering resolve. As I lay in bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from the initial shock and anger to the careful orchestration of consequences and the ultimate reclamation of control. The process had been draining, but it had also been empowering. I had learned that precision, patience, and calm authority are far more effective than impulsive emotion. Betrayal had tested me, but it had also honed my ability to act decisively, assertively, and ethically. By the time sleep claimed me, I felt a rare blend of exhaustion and accomplishment. I had turned a moment of profound violation into an opportunity for empowerment, not through vengeance, but through strategy, foresight, and self-respect. The events of the day had reshaped not only my relationship with my parents, but also my understanding of personal strength, accountability, and the delicate balance between love and justice. The morning after the second meeting with my father, I awoke with a sense of determination. The confrontation had shifted the dynamics of our family entirely. For the first time in decades, I felt the power firmly back in my hands. The $2.5 million wasn't just a number, it was a symbol of my independence, of my years of diligence and sacrifice, and of the trust my parents had violated. But more than that, it had become a tool through which I could assert boundaries and enforce accountability. I spent the early hours reviewing the outcomes of our prior discussions, thinking through every potential response my parents might have. Their behavior so far had oscillated between defensive and contrite, but I understood human nature too well to assume this would remain static. People, when confronted with consequences, can be manipulative, evasive, or even subtly undermining. I needed to ensure that every step I took going forward was deliberate, strategic, and airtight. By mid-morning, I had drafted a structured repayment and restitution plan. It wasn't simply about reclaiming the money. They had already realized the gravity of their actions. It was about ensuring that accountability was transparent, enforceable, and lasting. I included timelines, clear terms, and oversight measures, carefully wording each clause so that there could be no ambiguity. Every dollar had to be accounted for, every step documented, and every promise formalized. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Later that day, my mother called. Her tone was tentative, carefully measured, almost as if testing the waters to see if I was truly in control. She asked if we could discuss a way forward, expressing a desire to make amends and regain some semblance of trust. I let her speak fully, listening with patience and empathy, but never forgetting the boundaries that had been crossed. Her words were tinged with guilt, but also with a faint hope that perhaps this could be smoothed over without true consequence. I knew better. I invited her over, maintaining a neutral, professional demeanor as though this were a business meeting rather than a familial reconciliation. I laid out the restitution plan, step by step, highlighting the importance of accountability, transparency, and commitment. Her eyes widened slightly as she read each section, and I could see the weight of comprehension settling over her. The realization that this wasn't about punishment, it was about responsibility. She tried to interject with explanations, offering excuses rooted in parental authority and prior financial decisions. I listened, nodded, and then calmly referenced the documentation I had prepared. Every transaction, every withdrawal, every step she had taken without permission was accounted for. I spoke clearly, concisely, and with unwavering authority, leaving no room for deflection or rationalization. For the first time, I realized the depth of control I wielded, not through anger or confrontation, but through preparation, clarity, and meticulous execution. As the discussion progressed, my mother's posture shifted. She leaned forward, hands clasped tightly, and began to acknowledge each point I made. Her earlier defensiveness melted into tentative compliance. She realized that the power she had assumed for so long no longer existed, and that the authority over my finances and decisions rested squarely with me. The satisfaction I felt wasn't cruel, it was affirming. This was about reclaiming control, asserting boundaries, and demonstrating that trust, once broken, has tangible consequences. By late afternoon, we had agreed on specific actions she would take to rectify the situation. I allowed her input on minor adjustments, demonstrating that collaboration was possible, but always ensuring that the ultimate authority rested with me. This balance was critical, not just to enforce accountability, but to rebuild, if not the trust, then at least a functional familial dynamic where boundaries were respected. Later, I documented every detail of the day, from initial conversations to the final acknowledgement of terms. Every text, every signed agreement, and every verbal commitment was meticulously recorded. This was not paranoia, it was prudence. After all, boundaries are meaningless without enforcement, and accountability is only effective when it is verifiable. I wanted to ensure that my parents understood that future violations would not be tolerated and that their actions had permanent consequences. As evening approached, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The anger I had felt in the initial shock had transformed into clarity, strategy, and empowerment. I realized that betrayal, while painful, could serve as a catalyst for asserting autonomy and establishing clear boundaries. I was no longer a passive participant in my family's dynamics. I had reclaimed my life, my finances, and my authority. By the end of the day, a sense of calm authority had settled over me. My parents were aware of the gravity of their actions. The restitution process was in motion, and I had demonstrated decisively that trust, once violated, could not be taken lightly. The $2.5 million, while significant, had become more than money. It had become a symbol of empowerment, a tool for enforcing accountability, and a testament to the necessity of strategic action in the face of betrayal. Before bed, I reflected on the transformation of my relationships. While the financial betrayal had been deeply painful, the process of reclaiming control had illuminated my own strength, resilience, and capacity for measured action. I realized that true empowerment doesn't come from emotion-driven confrontation, but from thoughtful planning, clear communication, and unwavering adherence to principles. I went to sleep that night with a profound sense of satisfaction. Betrayal had been the spark, but strategy, foresight, and disciplined action had delivered the resolution. My parents had learned lessons they would not forget, and I had reclaimed not just my finances, but my autonomy, my dignity, and my sense of self. The journey had been challenging, but the outcome was transformative, a powerful affirmation that, when confronted with betrayal, careful strategy, and unwavering resolve can restore balance and command respect. The morning after finalizing the restitution plan with my mother, I awoke with a sense of renewed focus. I had spent the past several days orchestrating every step with precision, ensuring that the lessons my parents needed to learn were delivered decisively. Yet, even as the financial matters were being addressed, I knew that the deeper dynamics, trust, respect, and the subtle power shifts required ongoing vigilance. I began the day by reviewing all documents again. Every withdrawal, every account statement, and every correspondence was scrutinized. I wanted to ensure that no loophole existed, no ambiguity remained, and no opportunity for my parents to undermine the process. It was meticulous work, but it gave me a sense of control and clarity. I was no longer at the mercy of their impulsive decisions or misguided assumptions. The power had shifted entirely. Around mid-morning, my father called. His tone was cautious, measured, and for once, deferential. He acknowledged the terms we had agreed upon and inquired about the next steps for repayment and monitoring. It was a stark contrast to the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized our interactions for decades. I could hear the subtle weight of guilt and recognition in his voice, a testament to the undeniable authority I had established. I explained the oversight procedures I had put in place, emphasizing accountability and transparency. Each payment, each transfer, and each report would be carefully tracked, ensuring that restitution was complete and verifiable. I stressed that this process wasn't punitive, it was restorative, designed to ensure that boundaries were respected and that the trust they had violated could not be disregarded again. My father's voice wavered slightly as he responded, acknowledging the fairness of the approach and the necessity of compliance. After the call, I reflected on the intricate balance of emotions and strategy that had brought me to this point. Anger had been the initial catalyst, but it was strategy, patience, and methodical execution that had delivered results. I realized that empowerment doesn't come from reactionary measures. It comes from thoughtful planning, clear boundaries, and the courage to act decisively when betrayal occurs. Later that afternoon, my mother arrived to provide an update on her progress with the repayment plan. She brought documents, receipts, and a detailed outline of her compliance with the terms we had established. I listened attentively, reviewing each item meticulously. Her demeanor was cautious, almost hesitant, a reflection of the understanding that she was no longer in control. I maintained a calm, authoritative presence, acknowledging her efforts while reinforcing the importance of continued transparency and adherence to the agreement. We spent hours reviewing each transaction and verifying compliance. It was not about micromanagement, it was about accountability and the establishment of clear, enforceable boundaries. I asked questions, requested clarification, and ensured that every step aligned with the terms we had agreed upon. By the end of the meeting, my mother's posture had shifted. She was attentive, careful, and increasingly respectful of the authority I wielded. After she left, I documented every interaction. Each discussion, each verification, and each acknowledgement was meticulously recorded. This was not paranoia, it was prudence. After all, when trust has been violated, diligence and documentation are essential tools for maintaining control and ensuring accountability. I wanted to make sure that every action was traceable, every agreement enforceable, and every lesson undeniable. As evening fell, I took a moment to reflect on the journey thus far. Betrayal had been painful, but it had also been illuminating. It had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, assert boundaries, and develop a strategic approach to reclaiming control. The process had strengthened not only my financial acumen but also my emotional resilience. I realized that true empowerment comes not from impulsive reactions, but from careful planning, disciplined execution, and unwavering commitment to principles. Later that night, I reviewed my long-term financial strategy. I considered safeguards, estate planning, and contingencies for the future. The $2.5 million was not just money, it was a symbol of my independence, a testament to years of hard work, and now a tool to enforce accountability and respect. I took satisfaction in knowing that the lessons my parents were learning were as much about integrity and trust as they were about finances. Before going to bed, I reflected on the broader implications of the past few days. The journey had been about much more than reclaiming money. It had been about reclaiming authority, asserting boundaries, and demonstrating that betrayal carries consequences. I had transformed a painful experience into an opportunity for empowerment, using strategy, foresight, and measured action to restore balance and ensure respect. As I drifted off to sleep, a sense of calm and accomplishment settled over me. The trap had worked, the lessons had been delivered, and the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Betrayal had been the spark, but it was my intelligence, patience, and resolve that had forged the resolution. I slept with the knowledge that I had reclaimed control, established accountability, and demonstrated, once and for all, that trust, once violated, could not be disregarded without consequence. The morning of the final settlement, I awoke with a quiet sense of anticipation. The weeks of careful planning, meticulous documentation, and strategic action had brought me to this point. The $2.5 million, once taken from me without warning, had become far more than just money. It had become a symbol of accountability, of respect regained, and of the boundaries I had enforced with precision. I felt an unusual calm. This was not triumph for its own sake, but closure. By mid-morning, my parents arrived at my home. Their demeanor was noticeably different from the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized their behavior for years. They moved cautiously, almost deferentially, as though aware that they were entering a space where their authority no longer held sway. I greeted them with polite composure, masking the years of hurt and betrayal beneath a veneer of measured civility. I guided them through the final steps of restitution, ensuring each action was documented and verified. Every transfer, every acknowledgement of repayment, and every compliance check had been prearranged and prepared. My parents followed my lead without question, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the power dynamic. They were no longer the decision-makers. They were participants in a process I had designed to ensure accountability and enforce respect. As we worked through the final details, my father's voice wavered, tinged with both remorse and a hint of realization. He admitted, for the first time, that they had underestimated not only the financial implications, but also the moral weight of their actions. My mother, too, expressed a quiet apology, acknowledging that their choices had crossed a line that should never have been violated. I listened attentively, allowing them to speak while maintaining control over the process, ensuring that their words were not just empty gestures, but meaningful acknowledgments of accountability. The final transfer of funds was completed. I watched as the numbers reflected what was rightfully mine, not with glee or vengeance, but with a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about reclaiming money, it was about reclaiming agency, asserting boundaries, and ensuring that the lessons my parents had been slow to learn were internalized. The process had transformed the dynamics of our family forever, and I felt a profound sense of closure. After the settlement, I invited them to sit down for a final discussion. We talked candidly about trust, responsibility, and the future. I emphasized that while restitution was now complete, ongoing respect and accountability were essential. They listened, and for the first time in years, they seemed to truly understand the consequences of their actions, not just financially but emotionally and morally. It was a quiet moment of connection, one forged through the fire of betrayal, but tempered by careful strategy and principled action. Later that evening, I reflected on the journey from shock and anger to resolution and empowerment. The betrayal of my parents had been profound, cutting to the core of both trust and family bonds. Yet, it had also been a catalyst for transformation. I had learned to navigate complex emotional and financial landscapes with precision, to assert boundaries without losing integrity, and to enforce accountability without succumbing to bitterness or impulse. I thought about the lessons embedded in every step of this process, the necessity of foresight, the power of meticulous planning, and the importance of maintaining calm authority even in the face of deep personal betrayal. The $2.5 million, while significant, had ultimately served as a tool for empowerment, a tangible means to ensure that respect, trust, and integrity could not be disregarded lightly. As night fell, I felt a sense of finality and freedom. The trap had worked, the lesson had been delivered, and the authority I had reclaimed was unassailable. Betrayal had tested me, but it had also refined me, sharpening my understanding of strategy, human behavior, and the delicate balance between justice and compassion. I realized that true power lies not in retaliation or anger, but in deliberate, principled action that restores equilibrium and ensures that boundaries are respected. I spent the last moments of the day documenting the final outcomes, ensuring that every interaction, every agreement, and every transfer was logged for future reference. This was not about mistrust. It was about prudence, a recognition that when trust has been violated, clarity and documentation are essential tools for maintaining control and ensuring accountability. Finally, as I turned off the lights and lay in bed, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The journey had been arduous, emotionally taxing, and at times overwhelming, but the result was transformative. I had reclaimed not only my finances, but also my autonomy, my dignity, and my authority. My parents had learned lessons they would not forget, and I had proven to myself that even in the face of betrayal, careful strategy, unwavering resolve, and principled action can restore balance and command respect. In that quiet moment before sleep, I understood something fundamental. Betrayal can wound deeply, but it also offers an opportunity for growth, empowerment, and the assertion of personal boundaries. The $2.5 million was more than a financial asset. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of preparation, and a reminder that when principles are upheld with intelligence and foresight, justice can be delivered without compromise. With that realization, I closed my eyes, knowing that I had turned a painful betrayal into a profound affirmation of strength, strategy, and self-respect. The trap had been set, the lesson delivered, and the balance restored. I was free, not just financially, but emotionally and morally. And in that freedom, I found the ultimate satisfaction, the knowledge that even when betrayal strikes at the heart of trust, it is possible to reclaim control, enforce accountability, and emerge stronger, wiser, and fully empowered.